6 spectacularly spine-tingling spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified. My child's ghost. About 6 years ago, I moved into a maisonette which had just been purchased by my parents. I had been in the place for a couple of months and everything was fine. One night, I put my 2-year-old to bed. All was quiet for a while, so I did the usual and went upstairs to check on her. She was sound asleep in her cot, but as I walked out of the room and onto the landing, I felt a breeze rush past me. It felt like someone had walked past me and there was a very strong smell of lavender. I went downstairs, putting it down to my imagination. About 5 minutes later, I heard my daughter start talking, so I went upstairs and turned on the bedroom light. I asked my daughter who she was talking to, and she pointed to something across the room and said she was talking to the lady. This happened on several occasions, and sometimes in the middle of the night, I would hear my daughter talking and laughing with someone. Some mornings, I would go into her bedroom and she would have glitter on her face. Around this time, a friend of mine came to visit one afternoon. When she left, she put some cigarettes on the coffee table as I'd run out of them. I walked her to the car and went back inside. I remember noticing the cigarettes on the table and went upstairs to the toilet. On my return, the cigarettes were nowhere to be seen. There was no one else in the house at the time, and my partner was still at work, and my daughter was at my parents' house. I looked under the coffee table and saw that the rug underneath had been rolled up into a tube. I unravelled it to find the cigarettes inside. Obviously, my bad habits were not appreciated. Another time, myself and my partner had just gone up to bed. Our daughter was asleep and our cat was curled up at the end of the bed. Suddenly, I heard the phone start to beep as though it had been left off the hook. My partner went downstairs to find that this is what had happened, but none of us had used the phone that night. Also, it was one of those phones that was attached to the wall, so it couldn't have been knocked off the hook, rather it would have had to have been lifted. If I stood at the top of my stairs, I would always get a feeling of someone rushing up the stairs past me, and out of the corner of my eye, I would see a figure, but if I looked directly at it, it was never there. This went on for the first year that we lived in the maisonette. Things calmed down, and for a while, nothing really happened. Then, we encountered a run of bad luck. I had 7 miscarriages, including losing a baby when I was 5 months pregnant, and I also lost my grandmother, who I was very close to. Finally, last year, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl after having an extremely difficult and worrying pregnancy. I spent the last 2 months of my pregnancy in bed, unable to walk. I remember one particularly hot summer's day. I was in bed, my partner at work and my daughter at school. I burst into tears as I was so fed up. I have to point out that we had swapped bedrooms with my daughter. Anyway, I noticed in the corner of the room some lights had started to appear. For the first time in 5 years, I smelt the lavender scent again, and I began to hear a female voice. Although I didn't hear the voice physically, it was definitely in my head. It was the voice of a lady reassuring me that everything was fine and it would all be over soon. At that time, I was 35 weeks pregnant. The next week, I gave birth to my daughter. She was 4 weeks premature, but strong as an ox. A couple of weeks later, I woke up one night and again, in the same corner of the room, the lights appeared. I then noticed a very tall figure bending over my baby daughter's crib. I had the feeling that the figure was smiling at her and meant her no harm. I also had the feeling that whoever this person was, they were very pleased that we finally had a healthy baby. I know that a few of my neighbours had also had strange experiences in their homes. A neighbour of mine had a startling experience one night. She was rushed at by a dark shadow. Another neighbour had things moved a lot and heard scratching sounds in her bedroom. Another had watched a kitchen knife lift off the kitchen worktop and travel across the room before dropping on the floor. Several friends of hers witnessed this. I was intrigued by my haunting, so I decided to investigate myself. I knew a lady. I wouldn't really call her a friend, but more of an associate who claimed to be a medium. I never mentioned anything to her about what had been going on in my home, and none of my friends or relatives knew her, so no one could have said anything before her visit. As soon as she arrived, she commented on the smell of lavender, and she then said she felt a presence of a young lady who had lived in the masonette years ago. These masonettes were built in the 50s. My friend said she had a feeling that the young lady was running away from something or somebody, and that she had stayed in the masonette because she had felt safe. We moved out of there a few months ago and bought our own house, but we go back to the masonette regularly as my parents own the place and are redecorating it to let it out to the next tenant. On a recent visit, my partner went up to the loft to clear it out of all our Christmas decorations, old toys, baby clothes, etc. Whilst he was up there, he found some old paintings which neither of us remember being up there before. He brought them down, and on closer inspection, they had been painted by a girl called Laura. Unfortunately, there was no date on them, but it is a mystery how they got there. Like I said before, we go back quite often, and I always feel like I'm being welcomed. One night, as I sat in the car as we were leaving, I looked up at our old block, and I swear I saw a figure standing at the window of our old bedroom, watching us leave. The Russian Ghost. I saw a ghost while I was away on holiday in Russia. I was travelling by coach in a party of 8 to 12 others. We'd been travelling most of the day to get to the town of Kostromå in the Golden Ring outside Moscow. The countryside consists of vast expanses of Siberian birch and forests. As we neared the village, I noticed out of the window on my left a graveyard. Standing next to the grave was what I assumed to be a widow in a black cloak, mourning the loss of her husband. It was strange, but not unusual. I also noticed that in the graveyard was an orchard of cherry trees. I didn't think too much of it and looked away. Then, I glanced over my shoulder once more, and as I looked back through the coach window, the figure had moved and was now standing next to a low wall and a wrought iron gate. The figure was ominously tall, much more than normal, and it took on a threatening presence or shape. I noticed that it had no face in the hood. Far more disturbing though was that it seemed to be watching me, and its hands resting upon the wall were not human. The fingers were over a metre in length, skeletal, long and bony. As I continued to look back, a skull appeared in the hood and two orange eyes looked back, and it grinned at me. I looked away instantly and didn't look back, as I figured that it represented death. I thought I must have been imagining things, so I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind and get on with the rest of the holiday. Another thing that did strike me as odd was that the graveyard was completely run down and overgrown with long grass. No one had been there in months, or probably years. So what was this figure doing there? I tried not to think about it too much and eventually forgot about it. 2 days later, I arrived at another hotel and sat down to eat dinner in the main restaurant along with some other guests. As I ate, I looked up into the corner of the restaurant, and it was decorated with pots and other antiques. But what really drew my attention was a large wood carving by a Russian artist of a figure from Russian folklore. My blood chilled to the bone, for there was a carving of the hooded figure, a man who looked just like a monk. His eyes were black looking, and the arms on the figure were completely outstretched. Its fingers were long and bony, at least over a metre long. This is exactly what I had seen in the graveyard. I knew then that what I had seen was indeed real. Vanishing schoolgirl. I attended a small English boarding school located in the leafy suburbs approximately 30 miles from London. The school building was a modest mansion, previously a family home, whose entire upstairs had been converted into the boarders' dormitories. Thanks to the Victorian architecture, these could only be accessed by following lots of narrow, twisting corridors, small landings and stairs that branched off almost randomly. This incident occurred when I was 14 and was boarding in the top floor dormitory. One day, at morning break, I realised I'd left my maths textbook on my bed, so I raced upstairs to get it before the bell rang. I ran up the main flight of stairs, through a fire door, and past the matron's office. The dorms were deserted because everyone was in class, but at this point, I was joined by another girl running just ahead of me, so I couldn't see her face. She was blonde, wearing the school uniform, which at the time had a particularly fetching brown bri nylon design, which was hard to miss, and a purple scrunchie in her hair. So we were running up to the dorms together, round corners, down corridors, through fire doors, and being ahead of me, she would go first and I would catch the door in its backswing, and so on. As we got closer to the top dorm, I began to wonder who she was, because from the back, she didn't resemble anyone in my year. All of this took place in a matter of minutes, so you understand this was just an idle thought. Finally, we got to the top landing. She was making for my dorm and definitely wasn't in my year, so I was just about to say something when she pushed open the door, so I ran in after her and arrived in an empty room. I was completely and utterly alone. I remember very clearly the feeling of a total brain freeze as I took in the fact that the girl had disappeared. It was a sunny autumn day and I could see motes of dust moving undisturbed in shafts of light from the window. After about 3 minutes of just standing still in shock, I half-heartedly poked under the beds and in the cupboards, but I knew it was hopeless. There wasn't anywhere she could have closeted herself, as I'd been less than a foot behind her when I entered the room. In the end, I just grabbed my textbook and made my way back to class. I didn't tell anyone what happened for many years afterwards, and I'm still not even sure that I believe in ghosts. The Glasgow Ghost. In the early 1970s in Glasgow, Scotland, my grandfather Willie, who was an agent for various pop groups, was left alone in his house for the first time since he moved in. His wife had gone out to one of her singing gigs along with their young daughter. He hadn't been drinking and has never taken drugs, neither was he on any medication at the time. Around 2 a.m. in the morning, he went to visit the lavatory and then obviously came back to bed. He was lying awake when he heard heavy breathing beside him. He thought that it must be his own breathing, but when he held his breath, the other breathing continued. He then almost immediately felt a huge heavy weight on his chest and really thought he was going to die of suffocation. He said over and over in his mind, "God help me, God help me." The pressure eased almost immediately, even though this incantation was silent. Willie said he rushed out of the bedroom and into the living room, where he said that he looked into a mirror and saw his hair standing on end. He rushed out of the house and drove around until it was light. When he recounted the story to his wife, it frightened her enough for them to put their double mattress in the living room for over 6 months before they could sell the house. However, during that time, he said that his body sweated out a real stink for quite a few weeks after the incident, and he has never been able to explain any of it. We still can't quite work out what happened to Willie, and even when he recalls it to this day, you can see the fear in his eyes. The Ghost of St. Albans. I live in an old market town of St. Albans in southeast England. Our town was built by the Romans and we have a 14th century abbey and streets close to the modern city centre. All in all, a very beautiful and ancient place to live. One day, my mother happened to mention over lunch that our dog had refused to walk past the house in the medieval village of St. Michael's. I didn't believe her at all. so I took him down there myself. To my astonishment, when we got to number 61 or so, he stopped dead and put his claws into the ground and would not move. Sounds a bit cruel, but I needed to be convinced. He did this every single time we walked past, but was fine again literally steps further down the road. Once we picked him up and carried him forward, and we watched the actions of other dogs, but no other dog had the same fear. We discovered that the house had often been bought and sold. There seemed to always be a for sale sign outside. Anyway, reading through some history of the place, we found out that there were tunnels under all of these houses that the monks used to use to go to the abbey nearby. Not scary at all really, but further investigation told us that this particular house was built on the site of an old abattoir. I can't believe though that a dog could smell blood that was a few hundred years old. If that indeed was the case, we'll never know. The Hotel Mystery. On the 26th of February 2004, my sister Claire, who lives in Merlin Bridge, Sheffield, locked her house up and headed off to bed. It was 10 p.m. Her husband John and two children, Charlie, 13, and Louise, 10, were already in bed. She made her way to the toilet, which stands separate from the bathroom in a long corridor-style room with the toilet at the end of it. There was absolutely nothing on the floor and the window was tight shut. The next morning at 6:30 a.m, she got up and went to the toilet. There on the floor was a folded A4 cream piece of paper. On further inspection, she discovered it was an invoice for a well-known hotel in Scarborough, North Yorkshire. It was invoiced to a Mr. Simons with a Charnock address near Gleadless, Sheffield. It was for a one-night stay on the 6th of December 2003 and had a pink Visa card receipt stapled to the top left-hand corner of the page. She asked her husband if he knew anything about it and also her children, but none of them had seen it before or heard of a Mr. Simons. What was more astonishing was that the invoice was not in an addressed envelope and was in pristine condition, as if it had just come straight off the printer. Almost a week later, on the 3rd of March 2004, I called round her house to collect a letter I'd been expecting. I noticed the cream paper underneath my letter and asked, being nosy, what it was. She asked me to see if I recognised the name or address, which I didn't. She told me how it had appeared between the hours of 10 p.m. Thursday night and 6:30 a.m. Friday morning, and that nobody had a clue how it got there. I asked her why she still had it and had she looked into it all, to which she replied, "No, I've been meaning to throw it away about 4 or 5 times this week, but every time I had this thought, something made me put it back on top of the telly." I decided I would investigate for her, so the next day I took the invoice to work and got the telephone number for Mr. Simons from the Directory of Inquiries and phoned it up. I finally came into contact with Mr. Simons, who had no knowledge of a hotel in Scarborough, let alone the invoice. He suggested it might be his son, who travels around the country with his job, and said he would ask him to phone me when he got in from work. Later that night, I got a call from Mr. Simons Jr. saying that everything was correct. He did stay in that hotel, and that was his credit card number. He also remembered the invoice was folded into 3 with a Visa slip staple to the top left-hand corner. I asked him several questions to see if he knew anyone in my sister's family, or even my family. I asked him if he had received the invoice by post. He said he'd been given the invoice in the hotel as he checked out on the Sunday, and he personally folded it into 3, then put it in the glove compartment on his car. About a month ago, he decided to throw it away. He placed it in his bin in his bedroom without screwing it up. I asked him, what happened to the rubbish? He said his mother would have emptied his bin into the main wheelie bin outside. We tried to think of any logical explanation of how it could have got into a locked house in the middle of the night in pristine condition from the other end of Sheffield, where it had been thrown away a month earlier. Even if someone had taken it out of his wheelie bin, it would have been crumpled and dog-eared by the time it reached my sister's. I decided to invite him over to the house to meet us all, in the hope that something might fall into place. On Friday the 5th of March, he arrived at the house, but none of us recognised him. He wasn't even in my sister or my age bracket. I'm 38 and my sister Claire is 40, whereas Mr. Adam Simons Jr. is 21 years of age. The only slight link we uncovered was that he was studying at Sheffield Hallam University doing a property management and surveying course, and Claire is also at Sheffield Hallam doing a housing management course. We discovered that their paths could not have crossed because Adam finished last August to do a sandwich year and Claire didn't start until September. He told us that he had taken a now ex-girlfriend with him to the hotel. He asked Claire if she knew her, as she was also at the university doing a module, but Claire had no knowledge of her at all. I asked Adam if he had ever had a paranormal experience before in his life, thinking he just might be one of those sorts of people who have strange things happening to them all the time. He said, strangely enough, he hadn't until last Wednesday, 25th of February, the day before the invoice was discovered. He was working in Halifax, surveying an office, and had to do some inspections upstairs. The ladies on the counter could not leave the shop unattended as they were short-staffed, so they asked him if he could go upstairs on his own. He entered one of the bedrooms where they kept all the brochures, and in the corner stood a lady with her back to him. She had long black curly hair and wore a long black skirt. He thought it was a real person, so apologised for intruding, to which she didn't reply. On returning back downstairs, he asked the ladies on the counter about the woman upstairs. They just looked at each other and simply replied, "You must have seen Janet," the nickname they had given this familiar apparition. This was the first time in his life he had ever experienced anything like this. Finally, after an hour or so, we all agreed that the whole thing was totally unexplainable, so decided to just see if any more strange events would happen. As he left, we agreed to contact each other with any new information that may arise. On Sunday the 7th of March, my sister was going through her university notes when she noticed a printed sheet in her design and planning folder with a list of people's names. In one of the groups at the bottom of the list was the name of Adam's ex-girlfriend. She asked around the university the next day, but no one had seen her since before Christmas. In fact, she should have been there that day. My sister has never met her, and she is not in her group. I asked if Adam would contact her, but as far as I know, he hasn't just yet. I don't know if any of this has anything to do with my sister's house, but a few strange things seem to be happening there. Charlie hears footsteps running around the bedroom next to hers, which is empty at the moment. I too have had the same experience in that room about 11 years ago. Just this week, Charlie was touched on the arm by an invisible force and had an instant image in her mind like a memory. It was of a woman with blonde hair tied back in a bun, standing on some steps leading up to a house, holding a baby. Thanks for listening to this first big collection of stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please comment, like, share and subscribe. And if you really want to help support the channel, please join using the join button or donate on Patreon.